Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. We're so excited to have you here for our next session today. My name is Andrea Parthasarthi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a career and professional development specialist at UC Berkeley, and I'm your moderator for this session. I have the pleasure of welcoming everyone to Charting the Course for a Successful Career at the UC, presented by Aileen Liu, Susan Cass, James Kent Dudek, and Kim Sapp Dinwiddie. Susan Cass began her career as the receptionist for the Graduate School of Business, followed by the undergraduate orientation program coordinator at Stanford. From there, she served as a resident hall director at the University of Washington and admissions counselor at Pitzer College. Eventually, Berkeley made her an offer, and here she has served as a major advisor, departmental scheduler, GSAO, college advisor, dean's executive assistant, and strategic planning analyst, and staff support for the LNS Faculty Executive Committee, interim registrar, and is currently the manager for the registrar's undergraduate transfer credit and degree audit team. And you'll notice a theme amongst all of our presenters with lots of different moves that they've made throughout their careers. Up next is Kim Sapp Dinwiddie, who has been at Berkeley for over 22 years. She is the Director of Talent Management and Organizational Development in Talent Management and Workforce Planning at University Development and Alumni Relations. Kim provides HR and organizational consulting, instructional design and development, as well as training and facilitation to meet UDAR's strategic workforce planning needs. She managed Berkeley's first fundraising training program during the successful Light the Way campaign, whereby a shift in fundraising enterprise yielded a surpassed $6 billion campaign goal. In Central HR, she developed and facilitated campus-wide recruitment and hiring training, curriculum for managers, also providing campus-wide staff career development training. She started her career at Berkeley as a program director at Extension. She has a Master's of Education in Counseling, career development focus. Next, we have James Kent Dudek, and James is a senior organizational strategist for people and culture. He serves as an executive advisor to campus leadership on organizational development, strategy, culture, psychology, and change. James began his professional journey at Berkeley as a senior clerk typist A. Over the past 30 years, he's grown his career and along the way has been in 7 distinct job categories, including academic advising, policy analyst, organizational development, and chief of staff roles in 3 academic departments, 3 colleges, and 4 divisions. And last, we have Aileen Liu. Aileen began her career as a high school English teacher in Atlanta Public Schools. Missing being a student, she came to UC Berkeley for her PhD in English and then taught English literature at a small liberal arts college in Connecticut. Looking for a more stable career, and wanting to be closer to her loved ones out in California, she pivoted into higher education administration at the UC. She has been an academic policy coordinator at UCLA Graduate Division, a principal policy analyst at UCLA Academic Senate, and now Director of Curricular Engagement Initiatives at LNS Undergraduate Studies Division at Berkeley. So with that, let me pass it over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Andrea. And I just want to emphasize that today's conversation is really that, a conversation. And so we're eager to hear your questions and your feedback. Feel free to use the chat function to give your reactions. And then if you do have specific questions, please put them in the Q&A. As you think of questions, even as we're talking, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And if you could, try to direct your questions to specific participants, specific panelists, because that will help us field your questions. Okay, so we have a few questions just to get us started. And I want to say one thing, which is that, when I was putting together this panel, I was really thinking about who are the people on campus who have had really interesting non-linear and wiggly careers. And the reason I've been thinking more about this is that I have had a couple of big transitions in my own career, and I've had my own wiggly paths. And I also work in a function where I talk to a lot of undergraduates and PhD students who are themselves very anxious about non-linear career paths and feeling like they're doing something wrong. They think they just have to pick one ladder and then go up it. But when I've talked to colleagues on campus and across the UC, the people I vibe most with are the people who, like me, have had really non-linear paths. And so I wanted to put together this panel to demystify some of those transitions and job moves that people have had, and also start to unpeel some of the personal stories that are behind that, because it's not always for one particular professional reason or another. Sometimes they're deeply personal. And I'm hoping that our panelists today will be able to touch on those. I want to specifically call out Kim because I had the privilege of being an attendee at one of Kim's previous Now conference presentations. And Kim just gave this like incredible rock star presentation that demystified and broke open for me how to ask for more money and how to understand salary expectations within the UC. And I thought she was just an incredible resource to get from, for all of our attendees here in the audience, more of that sort of like behind the scenes perspective. And so Kim, she's had a really interesting wiggly career path, but what I'm hoping Kim will be able to play the role of today is a kind of commentator role. So as each of us are responding to some of these questions, I'm going to periodically throw things over to Kim to say like, Kim, with your sort of HR people ops hat on, what are some of the broader lessons or takeaways or actions that you can discern from some of these stories that are being shared that some of us in the room can replicate or think about taking on or exploring for our own career paths? Okay, so that's just sort of setting the tone for our conversation today. I'm already starting to see some questions in the Q&A box, which I love. So yes, please keep those coming. But I'm going to start us off by asking each of our panelists, maybe we'll start with Susan and then go to James. What was your first job at the UC? And what part of your background do you think was the catalyst for hire at UC? And did they convey that to you when you were hired?
Yeah, hello, everyone. My first job was serving as the undergraduate advisor slash graduate advisor slash scheduler, kind of like actress slash model at the Department of Nutrition, and now known as Nutrition and Toxicology here at UC Berkeley. It's interesting when I was pondering the background and catalyst, because I think a lot of it was persistence in a way. So when I first graduated my undergraduate career, I must have applied for 20 jobs here at Berkeley. I was keen to come back to the Bay Area after being in Central California and didn't successfully land anything. So then I ended up working at Stanford and went on to grad school. And then when I came back to the Bay Area from grad school, I still struggled in a way to find a position here at Berkeley. I tried again. So then that's when I landed at the University of Washington in Pitzer and spent 5 years doing some other roles. I think what the catalyst that finally did it was the time that I spent building upon my interests and finding my way, aligning my goals a little bit better with my strengths. So I saw an interview with Scott Galloway, and he was saying what he would advise for young people is to follow your talents and not necessarily your passion. And that really resonated with me because my passion was certainly to work with undergraduates and be part of a campus. But I was in positions that didn't necessarily reflect my talent. So I was a resident hall director and an admissions counselor. Admissions counselor was a little bit closer, but being on the front lines with students and working on sometimes, troubleshooting personal concerns or safety concerns, I could do, but really stressed me out and didn't jive very well with my well-being. And I did, and finally talking to a doctor one day said, I think you need to decide if you need to cognitively reframe who you are in your daily work, or if you're just a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. And that was really helpful advice. And a lot of my talents are more analytical, problem solving, systemic thinking. And once I started to kind of help coach people on their way to developing their own interests. So once I started honing on that a little bit more and realized that maybe I needed to get out in kind of the frontline positions that are stressing me out, I identified academic advising as my first step. And so that's the job I applied for to come here. So I think that was really helpful because I could speak to some of the skills I've developed, but in a space that I felt I could be more comfortable in doing the work and excelling in the work. I also think it developed in me some independence. And I think that was key in a way too, because when I finally landed the interview, it was in the 90s here, and there was not a lot of hiring in the kind of position I was interviewing for from the outside. It was a lot of internal hiring because departmental managers, I think, were a little nervous about knowing enough to train the person. And I think that I finally got in sync with someone who's willing to take a risk and hire someone from the outside. But I think the catalyst was that they felt confident I could have be independent enough to find my way in the job, that I had some of the natural skills that would fit, but I would be able to find my way. And I don't think that was said to me so much directly, but it's definitely a sense I got. I'd say the other catalyst too, which I may mention again, is talking to people about my job search, because I was in Southern California at the time. I talked to a good colleague there. I said, I'm applying for a job at Berkeley. And she said, what department? Nutrition. Oh, I think my friend's dad works there. What's his name? Len Bieldenese. And I looked him up. I said, Jennifer, he's the chair of the department. She goes, do you want me to write him? And I said, yes, please. And I did learn later that another catalyst was that Len walked into Michi's office, and Michi was the person who hired me and said, why don't you take a look at this Susan Cass? I heard from her from a contact. So that was another catalyst, was just talking about where I was going, what I was doing with friends, just to build, probably a little bit, it was a little lucky, but build that kind of connection.
Thank you so much, Susan. I just want to, before I turn things over to James to share his response to this question, I just want to note, I'm copying the questions that I'm asking each of our panelists into the chat. So even if you're joining a little bit late, just look back at where it says Aileen Liu and the question, so you'll be able to track the conversation. James, I'd love to hear from you. What was your first job at the UC, and what part of your background do you think was the catalyst for your hire at UC?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. My first role, as I mentioned in my bio, was a senior clerk typist A. So that was a half-time employee, a half-time role, but there was still a great deal of competition for it because it paid pretty well when I applied for the role. And it was a role when I was a student, but it was a half-time job. And I didn't know this at the time, but I stood out because I had done all the research about the department. I had actually specific questions about the role. I had read the job description, and I wore a tie. And I know this, and this is the 80s, not the 1880s. This is like the 1980s. And so this is before computers. And I was like 20 years old. So, when I went into this interview, I kind of blew them away because I had to go to a course catalog. It was the dramatic art department, which is now called Theater, Dance, Performance Studies. But I went to the catalog. I had an understanding of the curriculum. I had an understanding of what they were. I knew how many faculty they were. I knew how many students there were. I asked everyone around who I knew. I was only newer on campus. And so I later learned that that amount of research really meant a lot. Even though it was an entry-level job, I took it very seriously. And I think that was really, really important. About a year into that role, the receptionist job opened up. We had a receptionist in the very small department back when we used to have receptionists. She went out on maternity leave and she never came back. So my boss at the time said, well, Tammy's not returning. So do you want to be the receptionist? I'm like, well, I don't know. I did not think I did not spark joy with me, but I was an English major. So I thought, wow, they're going to pay me like $18,000 a year. That just seems incredible. And so I took that role. But what I learned about that was I learned so much from that role. I don't think I would have been able to apply for that role because I had none of that background. But because someone left on a leave, I took the opportunity to learn all about that role, which helped propel me to all these other experiences. Because in 3 months after I took that role, everyone in the organization left. And so I was actually running the drama department for 6 months. I was the CAO, I was the graduate and graduate under advisor. I ran admissions. It was pretty hellish, but I learned how the entire operation ran just from that experience. And so you never know what you're going to walk into. I think a trick I learned always in the future for successive roles was anytime anyone went out on leave or anyone left for another opportunity, I made a beeline to my boss's office and I said, hey, so Alan's leaving. Can I do part of his job? Can I help you do part of his job? And it was like this unofficial job training program for me. I just learned a lot by taking on other people's work on an interim basis, and then I could decide whether or not I wanted to apply for the job. You mentioned, Aileen, the catalyst piece, and one part of the catalyst work or the catalyst sort of approach that didn't apply for those roles I talked about, but for a role I had in the residence hall, I really wanted this job, but I was not qualified for this job, but I applied for it anyway because a colleague encouraged me, and I never heard from them. So I called a colleague and I just said, I'm not hearing from them. And she said, they're really, really busy. You should call every week. I'm like, I don't feel that feels invasive. And she said, no, call every week. So every Monday at 8:30, I would call and say, hi, this is James Dudek. I applied for that job and I'm still interested. Let me know if you want. If any other information. And I did that for 3 months every Monday. And 3 months later, they called me and said, are you still interested in this role? And then I got that job. And it turns out in the background, they were cycling through a hiring process of the people who were the most qualified, people who were somewhat qualified, but they didn't interview well or they didn't like it. And then they were like, well, there's this James Dudek who keeps on calling. Should we just entertain him? So you never know what's going to go on in the hiring committee's minds. And so a catalyst for me has always been like, just be persistent, be respectful, polite, but persistent.
So one thing that we realized when we were planning this panel and getting to know each other a little bit better is that we have a lot of humanities majors, humanities background folks on this panel. And I think that's why we were so excited to have a conversation like this, because it's so much driven by personal stories. But here's where I want to bring in Kim, because we love stories, right? They're inspiring, but I think we also want to know, like, what are the takeaways? And so, Kim, as I was listening to Susan and James, I was already hearing some takeaways. I was also hearing some resonance with some of the panels and sessions that I was in earlier today, including our keynote. Like what James was talking about made me think about what Gorg was saying this morning about making bids or being on the alert for bids. Susan, I think James also spoke to this importance of networking. And I know there was a session earlier today about networking. But Kim, I wonder, I would love to hear from you, bring you in this point. What are some like replicable things that you noticed from Susan and James' stories?
Well, thanks, Aileen. First of all, I will say that you're correct. I heard a lot of thematic elements of excellent tips for, number one, persistence. Number two, it can't be spoken highly enough to do the work James talked about, researching, learning as much as you can about the job, not just from the description, but from others who may know someone who knows someone and is willing to talk to you. Informational interviewing can be extremely valuable in that respect. And, sometimes persistence of the nature James provided does pay off. Sometimes they may get annoyed with it. So you definitely have to take cues from what you're hearing when you make those calls, etc. However, in James's case, he didn't receive any negative feedback along the way, and eventually it paid off. So paying attention to the cues of those around you when you're interfacing with anybody from the unit who may have influence as part of the hiring committee or otherwise will be helpful to be observant about. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in both situations, at the entry part of getting job opportunities, in Susan's case, learning specifically what you are really, really good at and being able to communicate about that is key, because you can have an experience and a background that may be present on paper, but it may not highlight the things that you're really, really good about that you really want to feature. And anytime you are communicating about what you want to do in a next opportunity, if it's not directly related, but it has some transferable skills or it is tied to what you want to do, you want to highlight those things first. And you want to bring those out in your summary. You want to really hone in on those particular skills. And then I want to close my commentary by saying that when you look at Berkeley Job Builder, or what is now just Job Builder because it is applicable to all the campuses, is this. There are templates for all the job families on the Berkeley campus. And in every template for all the categories within those families, there are specifications about the nature of the skills. So jobs like Susan was specifying with strong analytical capacity or unique elements of operations. In James's work, some of the things that he had learned from being in reception and learning all components of the operational parts of the position could be very valuable to look and see, is that a component of another job he wants to apply for? Knowing the integral parts of the organizational operations, that's going to be a key piece for him to make the connection there. And so looking at the key elements of skills required, what they call the knowledge, skills, and abilities section of the job descriptions in the templated language of all of Berkeley's jobs, can be extremely helpful. Yeah, that's a good place to go to look at how the job description you're looking at on the website that's posted, how that was derived. It's coming from that template. So walk through the actual template and where they got that from, and look at the base skills required for that classification level, required for that job. And if you're seeing things that are sort of related but not quite, go a step further and look at some of the other categories of jobs in that family, so that you can see what percentage of skills are required that are aligned with the nature of the work you want to do or that you have done, so that you can really hone in on those opportunities and then search for those when you do your job search. Search for those classification titles that are aligned with the nature of the skills you are qualified to handle. So that's where I'll close so that we can move on to the next question.
Thanks so much, Kim. And as Kim's been reflecting and sharing ideas, Andrea and I are putting some ideas and takeaways into the chat. So feel free to check those out. Andrea, thanks for that resource with the login page for Job Builder. Okay, we've got a few really wonderful questions in the Q&A already. And actually, one of them I want to go to now because it sort of dovetails with the question that I was going to ask next, which is, what did you find most challenging when you're considering jobs at the UC? But we have a question from one of our anonymous participants that says, here we go. How do you recommend answering interview questions that ask you to provide a specific example of doing a particular job duty, but you don't have an example/experience in it? And I wonder, Susan, James, Kim, if each of you could think not only about your experience as an interviewee, right? Like somebody who's applying for a job, but also if you've been on the other side of the hiring table as like a hiring manager or on a search committee, and curious, what are the candidates that ended up being the candidate of choice that maybe didn't have an exact, experience doing this exact job that you were hiring for, and yet really stood out for some of these transferable skills we've been talking about? James, do you want to start us off this time since we started with Susan last time?
Sure. Just a point of clarification, which part of that question am I answering first? The first one or that?
Maybe either, whichever speaks to you more.
Well, I think the most challenging part, the first part of the question, and then getting to the commenter of what was the most challenging when trying to change my job. I was a director of student services for a large academic department, earlier in my career, and I didn't know how to move on to another role, and so I was kind of stuck. I basically liked my work, and I had been in my role for about 3 years, and I liked student interaction. But at that point in my life, I was only 27 years old, and it just seemed like I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that for 30 more years, like that same exact job, but I didn't know how to do something else. And I had great job, reviews from my supervisor, and I got, the equivalent of spot awards, and I loved the faculty loved me. The students really liked me, but the students would graduate, every year. So the students I got to know the most would leave, and I'd meet, hundreds of more students, and that was very, very rewarding. But the point I'm trying to make is that even though I was really good in my job locally, no one on this campus knew I existed. So, the people in my immediate universe knew I existed, and 3 or 4 people I worked with directly, but no one else saw my work or saw my effort. And so and I didn't know this until I started getting out there and getting more involved in campus events. And so, by joining groups and staff organizations like being selected to be on the Chancellor's Staff Advisory Committee, and then being elected chair of the Chancellor's Staff Advisory Committee, that's when I started to grow my network, and people saw who I was and my work, and people from other units and other divisions and different departments, and I learned also about different roles and different opportunities on the campus. And I just didn't have that purview in the first 10 years of my career because I was so heads down in the role I was doing. I was just buried in administration. And so the challenge for me was someone taking me aside and say, you're hiding yourself. And so no one knows who you are. So you're applying for things and no one's heard of your name before. So I think one of the challenges was really building a platform. And after I was able to build a platform and people knew who I was asked to be on committees. And because I was asked to be on committees, I was referred to for different roles, and I interviewed for different roles, whether I got them or not. Some of the roles I interviewed for that I didn't get, people recommended me for some other roles that I did get. And so it's that visibility piece that I think was really, really challenging until someone told me that that was really, really important. And so I would really encourage people to find where their platform is and where they can speak from, so other people outside of your individual role on the campus know who you are. And then as far as like the questioner, I want to make sure I address the anonymous comment around how do you answer interview questions that ask you to provide a different and particular job skill. On both sides of the table, I would call this an opportunity to develop your skill set and just say, I don't have this skill set currently, but that's one of the reasons I applied for the role, because I'm really interested in learning and growing about this. On the other side of the table, as an interviewer, I've always wanted to hire more for people for their personality and their approach to the work. And the fact that I could figure that they could learn and adapt and adjust, I would weigh that over whether or not they didn't know 100% of all job descriptions, because I don't know that I've ever known 100% of all job descriptions or how to do that work. So I would really lead with the enthusiasm that you have around learning to do that skill set. And I would research the hell out of what that skill set is before you get into that room, so you could actually speak to what it is, even though you haven't performed it yourself. Susan?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah, I was kind of thinking along those same lines. I do consider the interview space a two-way street, even though most of the time I'm more eager to probably get the job than maybe just find out about the job in a way. But that is a hat I try to put on, because you're finding out as much about whether this is going to be a fit for you or what it's going to be like to work for the group that you're interviewing with, as much as obviously they're sussing out who's the best hire. So I think being honest is really important. And then thinking through how you would approach the duty. How would you start to learn about the duty? What kinds of things you would seek out? Because I think that would help the panel to understand just how you problem solve, which is a big part of any job. So that's how I would approach it. The other thing I would say too, and that to segue sort of into challenging, is, and there's another question in the queue too about just persistence when you haven't been as successful over time. And so part of it, I think, is accepting that it does take time to land the right role, and then accepting that the right timing may not be about you. And I'm still trying to figure out how to say that, but if you are part of a pool and the people in the panel don't know, and you don't know who else is going to be in the pool and what strikes them as they're interviewing the candidates in terms of landing the right hire. So you may be a very strong candidate in the role, but there might be just something other quality that another applicant has that is why they make the decision to hire them at that particular time. And you could have been a perfectly fine choice and one of their top choices. And then it's just a matter of, making the decision that works best according to whatever kinds of things they're thinking about for the need on that team, or what presented itself with candidates that, they may not have expected in the pool, because there's such a range of skills that candidates have that just happen to stand out. So I think that's challenging, because I think when you hear the no, you assume you just weren't the right fit, or you were underskilled, or you didn't answer the questions correctly. And I think most of the time that's really not the case. It's just happens to be the collection of people that apply and where that goes and what you can learn from that experience. So I think that's it, is having patience. And, I had a position here at Berkeley, and I knew 2 or 3 weeks in, it really wasn't the right move. And I was there 4 more years. So that, took the timing for the right position. And also, I applied for a position that I didn't get, and then it reopened 2 years later, and I got it. And I learned how many things had changed and were revised about the role that was so much better for me than it would have been the first time around. So that's kind of what I need. You just don't know what the right timing might be. So I think seeing where you are, that's the beauty of working on campuses, is there's so many things we can try out. So to echo James, where else can I show my skills? Where else within the role? And how I persisted for 4 years is I just said, well, how can I grow here? What can I do here? What can I learn personally here. And I tried to live in the moment and glean as much as I could, just trust that that was going to prepare me for the next move. So so those are things that I recommend. But yeah, I think it's really important to not feel like you have to have 100% of experience for all the things mentioned in a job, but get the better part of what you think the focus will be or what the need will be, and then show your skills in terms of what you would imagine going forward.
Kim, I see you nodding a lot during their answers. I'd love to hear you chime in now.
Sure. So comments for both of the panelists who just spoke. James's point of serving in a joint capacity, whether it be part of a committee or part of a joint project with an adjacent unit or department that works closely with your own, so that you are able to start using those skills while also offering some of your own based on the joint nature of that work or that project, can be an extremely beneficial function for serving as a catalyst to a new opportunity. So definitely agree with James on that. And there are a number of ways to do that. Committees, joint units, like I said, adjacent functions, but also either serving as a BSA mentor or taking on the opportunity to be mentored by someone through the BSA program. Both of those can be extremely beneficial and yield both the networking and potential joint work in the future as well. So that's another recommendation I would have. With regard to some of Susan's comments around how to frame yourself if you don't have a certain skill that's required in a job, the best thing I can recommend is find whatever components of that skill you may have in a transferable capacity. So what you can say is, I agree, be very honest. Well, I don't have contextually the experience of X, Y, and Z as it's defined here, but I want to point out that in a different context, half the skills framed here were utilized in this way. And I firmly believe that in a different setting, I would be able to provide and allow XYZ growth opportunity for the unit by being able to provide this unique context that I have exposure to that could be beneficial to your audience, for example. Let me give you one example. When I first started at Berkeley over 22 years ago, I started off as a program director in UC Extension. And although originally they wanted somebody with a bachelor's or master's degree in computer science and business technology, because that's what I was going to be leading a portfolio of courses and faculty for, I didn't have that. I had a master's degree in education. And it turns out they ended up hiring me because I had just come from working in the industry, hiring those people in tech recruiting, et cetera. So having an education background and career counseling background, as well as that IT recruiting background, was in the end more valuable to them and the program management experience that I had than someone with that degree that they originally thought they preferred. So in the end, being able to point out how some of those contextually different but transferable skills can benefit them can be an extremely effective way at framing how you're going to be able to provide a significant contribution in a way they haven't thought of, and make them look at that more so than the void of the skill you're identifying as not having initially.
Thanks, Kim. We have a cluster of really great questions in the Q&A, and I encourage everybody to keep sending in your questions. I've also turned on the upvote feature. So if you have a question in there, you're like, oh man, I really want them to answer this one, give us that feedback by clicking that little thumbs up icon, and we can make sure to cue that one a little bit earlier. I want to go to this question about these wiggly career paths. The question from the anonymous participant is, do you think that there's still some amount of stigma around candidates who have wiggly careers? I always worry a prospective hiring manager would see this as being unfocused or confused, when actually someone may just have many interests. So you're nodding. I feel like maybe this is speaking to you a little bit. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about this question.
Yeah, I think first is you getting it over yourself. You may not have any concern about it, but I think that was just part of my journey, because certainly when I started on student affairs and did jobs like resident hall director, admission counselor, things like that, there's definitely a ladder you go up, and you get more and more proficiency going forward. And I think I presumed I would, and when I found out it just wasn't fitting, I found that I found that I had to let go of the idea that this was the way to do the best work, was to be on the front lines, continuing to work in these areas. And I considered it less than to consider jobs that I was really drawn to, which was more behind the scenes, policy, systems, other kinds of things. And so that was the first part, is just for me to kind of work my way out of that thinking, and then decide and free myself from following a particular path, and then rather than just following my strengths and interests, because I've never had a straightforward path in my career. And once I let go of that, then I'm like, I'm just going to take the job when I look at the description and talk to the people is the next thing I want to work on. And once I freed myself, that was really helpful, because I think maybe having done that, it just shows your confidence when you're going to the interview, because that's the thread that you're thinking about. So that's one. I think, again, researching the position and finding, I think really a lot of jobs are skill-based, and the knowledge just comes with being in the role, right? And so I think if I thought about it in that way, I think there's a very straight path through my career that isn't very wiggly, because of the particular skill sets that I use time and time again, and I talked about time and time again in interviews. So that's a very straight path, right? So that might be another thing too, is to find what you find to be the straight lane for yourself, so to speak, and then be able to translate that in each of the jobs that you're interested in, and talking about how that would apply. So that would, take the time to learn about other parts of campus. And like James, I've worked in a lot of different and with a lot of different people across campus, and I'm just curious about how things work here. So I think taking the time and building that knowledge and have something to say about the unit and how that works is another way to combat it. So I feel there's less concern in a way. It probably just depends on the depth of expertise you need to draw from. I'm in the registrar's office now, and I did the interim role, but I didn't apply for it because I knew that for some of the policy and things we have to steward here in this office, somebody with a depth of knowledge, having grown up in a registrar role, probably would be a better fit. So that's the other piece too, is just knowing what pieces of the job might open a little bit more of a door, what piece of expertise, maybe something either if you're interested and you really do need to train on, is another way to kind of find your way through the winding road.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this one, or we can go to our next question?
Yeah, I would definitely say that I love everything you said, Susan. I definitely also say that the wiggle is a strength, not a weakness. It's and there are a lot of ways that wiggling gives you a diversity in your portfolio that makes you kind of a unicorn in different ways. And I saw this throughout my career I used to be like sort of depressed about, oh God, James, what do you want to be when you grow up? And like, you don't seem to have a focus, and you have to be really oh, look, a squirrel. So somewhere like, after that first big job change, I'm like, maybe I'm just going to do what sounds really exciting to me. And so opportunities came up. I'm like, this sounds really awesome. This scares me, some of it, but it sounds really, really great. And so I want to do that. And when I made the transition from being an academic advisor to being a business systems analyst in an academic department. And then we were doing a systems integration project for student services, one that failed, which was really interesting, before the current SIS. They were looking for a business systems analyst, and I applied thinking I would have no chance of getting it. And then after I got the job, they said to me, a couple of months later, you were the only one we would hire. Like, you were the only one on campus who actually understood academic advising, and you were a business analyst. We had lots of business analysts who applied. We had lots of academic advisors who were interested, but only one person in the entire pool had both experiences. I'm like, that was me? Like, yeah, who else does that? So, having a diversity of experiences, I didn't do it because of that. I did it because I liked the work and I wanted the challenge. But that really led me to be a candidate And that was rare in a way I didn't really even think about that. So I definitely think that it's a strength to have that diversity of experience. And looking back at the experiences that I've had, and I look at my resume, it definitely, I've had lots of different experiences, different job categories, as we talked about. But there is a common throughput, and I think Susan has sort of intimated this about her own role. I started as an academic advisor. That was my first big boy job on campus. And then I moved on to be a business systems analyst, where I was interviewing users and then advising the programmers of what needed to be built to satisfy the customer. And then I became a chief of staff, which was advising an executive on organizational development. And now I'm a senior organizational strategist advising campus leadership about strategy and changes. And so over those 30 years, jobs were different, colleges were different, roles were different, but advise. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that was my through point that I didn't even know. I really like being advising people and helping them. And so that was the common thread for me. So but the opportunity for you, regardless of how you wiggle through different areas, is like, what's the thing about all those different experiences that you're doing that sparks joy? And how can you sort of quantify that when you talk about your experience?
I think the other thing I should add, and this is just my opinion at UC, and of course I'm more steeped in Berkeley, but I think as far as being in a lane or a division, I think in the organization of these campuses, we've gone as far as we can go. The work ahead to make this place better is working across units and across campus and across systems, because we are interdependent, and we have to own that. So personally, I think if you are building those skills, that will be sought after, as was identified in James's example, because there's a lot of good work to do in partnering and having some knowledge of areas that you're bringing in. I'm always drawing upon my previous role to even broaden the context or sharpen a context in my next role. And I do think that that's a huge need for us at Berkeley in particular, perhaps at the other UCs too.
I think what both James and Susan are addressing is, I think, James, you had a really nice line. Wiggly is a strength, not a weakness. And one of the things that Susan said to me when I first met her, when I first started in this job on campus, she described herself as a generalist. And I thought that was so eye-opening to see oneself as a generalist, and also to see the strength in that, like that curiosity and that seeking. And I think that's what, at least for me, I find really exciting about being an employee in the UC, because there are so many different parts of campus that you could work in. I could build an entire career in the UC, but not have to do, one job family or one job for the rest of my time here. And that, I think, is deeply appealing. I think what keeps many of us here on campus for year after year. I want to address a specific question to Kim that's come in through the Q&A. It's got 2 upvotes, so I want to make sure we get to it. The question is in the chat now. What advice do you have for folks seeking to enter a specific field in UC that is different than their current position and they aren't getting results from applying as an internal hire? Also interested in advice for transitioning out and then back into UC.
Well, I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'll go to the first one. When you exit, and I'm going to say higher education versus just UC. When you exit higher ed and you go into the corporate sector or perhaps nonprofit sector, whatever the case may be, it's actually a significant benefit, because I did that at one point in my career. I knew that what I learned in the corporate sector would only be of greater value to higher ed if I went back, because of having the contextual awareness and, based on the nature of the work I was doing, being able to be more helpful to those exiting higher ed and going into the corporate sector thereafter, and being able to reflect on experientially the nature of the work, or culture shift, the kind of culture differences, et cetera, and being able to provide advisement and direction was going to be helpful. So looking at how the skills acquired, how the culture differences experienced are something that you can reflect on as beneficial when you return, is going to be the framework for how you'll want to describe and explain the benefit, and how you'll be able to contribute having both vantage points. So that's the direction I would go with that question. The first question, When you are entering a field that is different than your own, I will have to say it is very, very difficult to do if you are unable to draw a strong percentage of transferable skills. And if you look really, really hard, you will find them. But this is why one of the first pieces of advice I gave at the origin of this presentation is that you want to go look at all the career tracks, job cataloged, families and categories that are related to the thing you think you want to do to the one that you're currently doing. Literally take not just the job posting itself that has all the customized content for the unit you're interested in exploring, but take the template from each of those jobs and look for the commonalities. Look for the things that they're both asking for. When you see those commonalities, do a percentage breakdown and then find a way to demonstrate how that is so in both positions and describe that to the new prospective unit, employer, or significantly different job or job family. And so if you're able to hone in on those differences with showing the actual commonality that exists, you'll actually show and highlight your transferability of skills. I'm going to give you an example of something that was done on campus many, many years ago that I helped with. Years ago, several years ago, probably 10 to 15, the academic personnel officers that were part of the campus positions and cultures on campus, they were having a hard time finding people qualified for that work. It's very unique. It's a different kind of HR than staff HR. And there was so much challenge in finding people qualified to do that work that we approached the problem campus was having very much in the same way I'm suggesting you would approach moving into a new role. And we looked at all the jobs in career tracks, which used to be called Career Compass, and said, what jobs have 75 or more percent skills required for this area? How can we pull the people who are currently in those roles and say, would you be interested in a new opportunity? And look at the writing skills that were required, the analysis that was required, etc. And we ended up pulling about 20 different job categories and families and invited those people directly and specifically to a career event where academic personnel officers were able to share the nature of their work and educate them on the nature of the work and encourage them to apply for those opportunities. So this practice of what I'm recommending has gone both ways, both from an prospective employee looking for other opportunity and for the employer looking for qualified candidates. So I can't recommend that enough.
I want to say another through line that I'm hearing between Kim's commentary and then what Susan and James shared about that wiggly question. And then I see James has his hand raised, so I'm going to come back to him, which is that it may feel wiggly when you're on it, but that challenge is to the future employer to show how it is linear. And I think sometimes that linearity won't become clear until you're in it. I find that often when I tell people my story, they hear about my job now, and then they hear about all the experience I had in the past, and they're like, oh, it seems so obvious. It seems so inevitable that you would have the job you have now. But I'll tell you, it did not feel inevitable when I was in my job search process. And there's so many different ways that it could have gone. I think that's one of the challenges that many of us experience. You know, we may start to feel a little antsy, or maybe are keeping our eyes peeled for that next role, but we're not quite sure what that might be. And so the next set of questions I want to go to in the Q&A box are a cluster of questions that are about like feelings about this, like that sense of fear or that sense of, morale. That I know that we all experience when we're doing that kind of career ideation and active career searching. It can really grind us down. And so I'd love to hear some wisdom from our panelists today about how to manage some of those feelings. But before I do that, James, I want to give you a chance to chime in.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make a comment on a couple of things that Kim said. One, a while ago, she mentioned the importance of BSA and being in the BSA mentorship program. That is so huge. I was able to get a mentor in that program many years ago, and I have mentored now for like 10 years. And you learn a lot and you get a visibility into the campus in both roles, and the people you're mentoring, you're helping, also are educating you along the way, and you have to be open to that because you learn a lot. And it reminded me of what Kim had just mentioned about, how you research roles and job builder and things like that. Another way, in a project I worked on with a mentor who was a mentee who was interested in growing her skill set in the policy project analyst role, is I showed her how to use the UC salary website, UCOP salary website, and to look up how many people have that job on the Berkeley campus. And so you can find out, let's pick on the business systems analyst role again, like how many BSAs are there in Berkeley? And you go to that list, and the list you can find and search by the job category, and you can get the names of all the people who were in that job at least 2 years ago anyway. And then I would use a board of directors, which I call my advisors, the people in my life who advise me, and campus buddies that I have. And I would put that list before them saying, do you know any of these people? Can you introduce me to any of these people? Because I'd like to have an informational interview about what their job is. And so, that's another way, another approach in tandem with Kim's that could be really successful. And I know it's fearful for people to reach out to other people, especially when you don't know them. But I give you my word, in over 30 years on this campus, no one has ever turned me down for a coffee date or a Zoom date in the New Times. I have never turned anyone down who's asked me for an informational interview. It just, we don't do that, which is one of the wonderful things about working here. So thank you.
Thank you, James. Yes, I also can't stress enough, the power of the informational interviews. And I think for each of you, you spoke really clearly about the benefit of being known to other people, and informational interviewing, networking. That's one way to be known to other people. Some of the other things that have already been mentioned, the BSA mentoring program here at Berkeley, what's the other one that we talked about? Serving on campus committees and serving those kind of leadership functions. That would be my quick answer to one question that came in the chat about, how do you move from an individual contributor role to a managerial supervisory role? You might find leadership opportunities on campus or other types of committees. You could take a leadership role there and sort of prove yourself in those ways. Or like James had mentioned earlier, serving on a project that's cross-functional and taking the lead on that. So sort of leading another team, even though you don't have direct supervisory experience. Those are maybe my quick answers to that particular question. Okay, I want to go to these questions of feelings, because we all have a lot of big feelings around the job search, a lot of doubt, and also how do we maintain relationships and our healthy boundaries as we do this? And so I want to draw on a cluster of questions. I'm just going to put them all into the chat and then invite each of our panelists to maybe choose one of them that you'd like to answer, because I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them, but we have such great questions. I don't want to lose on all of them. Okay, so the first question is how to get over the fear of changing to a new job you don't have much experience in and don't definitely know you'll like when you're decently happy in your current role, but ready to move on. Another question about feelings, can you share more about your decision-making process when making a choice to transition during your career, i.e. choosing whether to take a job offer, pursue another ladder, etc.? I think both of these are sort of about how do you know when to get off the fence? If you're sort of on the fence about something right now. And then lastly, this question about morale. Susan, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do you keep up morale, especially if you're somebody who's trying to break into the UC and you don't seem to be getting anywhere? I speak to a lot of job in the UC and are hoping to get some insight in what the hiring process looks like. Candidates. I think that's sort of the hidden question that I have a bunch of questions that I've put into the chat. Very curious for each of our panelists if one of them speaks.
Feelings, yeah. I think I'm more of a head over heart person, so I always have to tell myself I always have to take feelings seriously, and that's true too. I think maybe it's going back and forth between what you need to maybe reframe for yourself in grappling with feelings. And I guess, just the example I gave earlier about maybe feeling like I was not doing as noble of a job if I wasn't on the front lines. But then when I reframed for myself, drawing upon my talents and knowing that what I'm doing behind the scenes also contributes to the well-being of students and staff here, it's just another way to do it. So that's kind of an exercise too, is just maybe what are investigating some of your thinking patterns to help through the feelings. I think, leaving a position, knowing when you're ready. Yeah, I did have that experience actually for this current role that I'm doing. So the person who was in the role before me, I worked very closely in conceiving of the role actually, because I'm the second person that's had this job. And she had to move on. Her family was moving back east due to a job change. And I said, wow, we're just going to have to find somebody good. And she goes, no, you're going to apply for this job. This is, this is for you to do. And I loved where I was. And it was, something I fought hard to get. And so I really had to grapple with that. And again, it was thinking through, reassessing where I was, reflecting upon myself. Gorick talked about this morning. I don't know if you guys were in the keynote. He had a quote about reflecting. I've lost track of now, doing the reflecting and then getting the bids. It was a bid, right? So I had to kind of go through that reflection exercise to think through and I had to kind of jump into my future self. So I think that's what I would consider in those spaces is, even though you're happy where you are, could this be a timing where maybe that opportunity is really going to take you next level and you'd be glad to have it going forward. The other thing I would say too is, again, it's a two-way street. I don't know what Kim would say to this, but just because you apply for a job doesn't mean you have to take it when it's offered to you. And I have turned down offers, and I've removed myself from searches after the first round of interview because I'm investigating the process too. So, just going through the exercise, and I've done this for a couple jobs now recently. I went through the exercise. It helped me get my resume updated. I got my LinkedIn updated, and I got myself in the experience of talking about it with people. And then when I actually was in the interview, and that feedback really helped to know if this was the right time or not, right? And so I think just taking the steps and just assessing along the way is also really good. You can apply perhaps with the intention of not being sure if you would take it once you got the offer, right? You have to know more about the position perhaps and go through that. So that's what I would say about that as well. In terms of burning bridges, this has been the case. I mean, hopefully most supervisors are professional in the sense that that's their biggest reward is to see people successfully move on. But, probably what to be conscious of is leaving a job well and how you're going to do that and what you're going to leave behind in terms of the little notes or a handbook or, I've been at Berkeley all along, so I completely have offered myself to consult with people who've taken jobs after me, and I'm happy to do that as well. So that would be something to be aware of. So I think I did a potpourri of responses, Aileen, but those are some of the comments I would have.
Great, Susan. Thank you. Kim?
I was just going to echo what you said, Susan. The bottom line is that an interview is absolutely you're interviewing them and they're interviewing you. And if you can maintain that frame of reference and keep that in your mind fully the whole time, you will actually reduce your anxiety and fear about the process. Because you need to come up with a list of questions based on the research you have done that James so eloquently talked about at the front end. Doing research about the unit, having a lot of questions about the nature of the work, asking what kind of main projects you're going to jump into in the first 3 to 6 months, how, based on their answer, you're going to be able to contribute and help with that is going to be a follow-up response to their answer to your question when you do get the opportunity to ask questions. So making it clear from the nature of the questions that you ask and the direction you take once they give you the opportunity to lead that part of the interview is pivotal to them realizing, wow, we want this candidate, so we need to be realizing that we're putting our best foot forward here as well, and letting them know why they should come work for us. So it's very, very recommended to have that approach and that mindset so that you do minimize your anxiety. And I'll go ahead and let James move forward.
Yeah, yes, I agree with everything that was said beforehand. And I would also talk about the fact that it's less burning bridges and you're providing your current unit with an opportunity. And I would pose it as that, not that you're asking permission. You have your own right and your own agency to move to another role. But what sweetens the pot, and a good supervisor knows this, is that when I moved from IT to the world of HR, which is where I am now, they were well aware that their James was now in HR. So they expanded their network, and now they have an in HR. That doesn't mean favoritism or anything else, but it means that I am someone who can advocate for IT within HR because I have all this IT experience. And so it really does behoove the organization to move people around as knowledge experts, because then you get a fuller sort of view of the organization. So it's a total strength that you're leaving an organization and not burning a bridge. And, people won't remember a lot of what you've done tactically in a job, but they'll remember how you left. So, aforementioned, just leave responsibly, give enough time's notice, follow questions, always be there to answer questions, whether you leave the unit or the campus. You can leave a job really, really good. And I think that's really important. I think going to the question about managing emotions is really, really important. I mentioned earlier around having a board of advisors, like who are your trusted friends and colleagues at Berkeley and in the world, and your family, your spouse, your cats, and I would gather them together and say, I'm really feeling anxious about this change. Why do you know me? Why am I feeling this way? Or ask me some questions about how I'm feeling this way. And really good colleagues and family they'll ask you really interesting questions that you cannot ask yourself because you're in your own head. And they can challenge you and say, well, that's not you. And I really want to say, very new age, Northern California, you can't reason with emotion. There's a reason why there's some trepidation around changing jobs. It's exhausting. Changing from one role to another is exhausting from different departments, but definitely changing from different career paths, from different roles and responsibilities, going from IT to HR or advising to analysis. It's like, those are different people, different players, different structures, different cultures. There's a reason why your instinct is telling you this is going to be tough, because it is. But, asking those questions about your board of advisors, it also shows up support when you say to your spouse, I think I'm gonna make this change. So it's gonna be dodgy for me for a while. So I'm gonna need your support. And so, I think that's really important to talk about those things and get that out of the way and process it.
Thank you, James. And I love talking about feelings because it's one of those things that I think sometimes we might feel like, oh, is it appropriate to talk about feelings? But also it is so personal. I think every time I put together a job application, if I want to do a good job, I'm really having to imagine myself fully into that role, right? I want to tell a really persuasive narrative. And so I'm really imagining this possible future. And to then have that future cut off because I didn't even get an interview feels awful. It feels like a total rejection. It also feels like a possible future that's just been like deferred or like completely killed off. And so I just want to name that for the people in this room, because I think we've all experienced this, including all the people who are on our panel today. We are coming up on the last 5 minutes of our panel today. We have a few questions in the Q&A that I think actually I would really love to hear from our audience, because even though we have our 3 fabulous panelists who are being featured today, I know that there is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and expertise from the participants that are currently in this Zoom room. These are your board of advisors, shall we say, for the next 5 minutes. So I'm going to put the questions that remain into the chat and invite each of you, if you have a piece of advice to share, to go ahead and put it into the chat. Try to thread it if you can. I'm just going to put them in here right now. So the first question has to do with what if you aren't the greatest interviewee? Maybe you flub your answer. I'm very curious what advice you all have for this person. And Susan, James, Kim, if you would like to chime in on any of these as well, please do so. This B is about providing references during the interview process when you're like, I don't want to ask the people that know me because they're in my job right now. What do you do? Especially those early career people who maybe this is the only job they've had so far. Question C, any advice on how to truly find out what the culture of the new team is like, management style, team dynamics, etc. The team and leadership style is so important for job satisfaction and fit. Many of our panelists today have talked about that being a two-way street in the interview and job application process. So how do you figure that out? I think we might have some good ideas here in the room. And lastly, D, do you have any more specific advice for folks who are more early career, less than 5 years of work experience? I find it hard to find something that will be a good move without the position maybe being too above or a little too below my level. And I see Andrea's come onto video. And so Andrea, do you have some messages to close us out as we are wrapping up today's session?
I do, and I'm sorry I've got to wrap it up. This conversation has been so interesting. So thank you, Susan, James, Aileen, and Kim, for bringing us all together for this conversation. And thanks to all of you in the audience for your really thoughtful questions.